I'm Bart Ehrman. I've been a member of the faculty at UNC since 1988, and I'd like to give an introduction to what it is we're going to be doing today. First, about religion in general. As you know, the religions of the world continue to play an enormous role in our history and culture. And they're massively important for understanding the world's political and military conflicts, social and economic policies, and the histories that have brought us to the place we are. On the personal level, religion deeply influences the vast majority of the world's population, not just in terms of what they believe, but also what they value, how they conduct their lives, and what kind of social and political agendas they support. While the importance of religion continues unabated, knowledge about religion is dwindling. Our department at UNC, the Department of Religious Studies, is one of those institutions that works to counter the widespread ignorance of our world. An ignorance that's not simply remarkable and lamentable, but also quite dangerous at times when not understanding or mischaracterizing the views of others of other religions can and has and continues to lead to serious disaster. The Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill was established in 1946. It's one of the oldest in the country. And by any metric you apply, it's one of the very best departments of religious studies in the Western world. Here we teach undergraduates and graduate students in a range of academic fields involving the history, literature, ritual practices, philosophy, ethics, and everything else connected with major religions of the world: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Native American, and others. This fundraiser is to help support the department's graduate students who are very much in need of additional resources to pursue their careers and further our mission. We're asking, as you know, for a $20 donation, but we'd appreciate any amount you can give, especially if that amount is larger than $20. And we especially appreciate those that are much larger. As a benefit, our two top donors will receive signed books by Jodi of the book we'll be discussing today, Jerusalem Through the Ages. I want to talk. I'm sorry, if you want to talk about providing major support to the department, if you're interested in providing us with the kind of financial resources that we need in order to continue our work, please simply contact our chair, Barbara Ambrose. Just get in touch with her at the Department of Religious Studies, or if that doesn't work for you, just send me an email, and I'll tell you how to go about it. The money for this particular fundraiser is going to one of our most important funds in the department, called the Robert Miller Fund. It was established in 2013, and it's named after an editor at Oxford University Press named Robert Miller, who happens to be a graduate of UNC in a different department, but has been the editor for some of us faculty members over the years. The fund is designed to support graduate students. We get some of the best graduate students in the nation in our department, but in contrast to other schools, we have far more limited resources. This fund, the Robert Miller Fund, provides funding to allow our graduate students to attend professional conferences so they can present the results of their research to broader audiences, and by doing so, prepare them for lives of scholarship and teaching at the university level. So we very much appreciate your support, and you can see how to make a donation at our website that you see on the screen. It's just religion.unc.edu/giving. The topic of our panel discussion today, will be Jodi Magness's recently published book, Jerusalem Through the Ages: From Its Beginnings to the Crusades, published by Oxford University Press in 2024. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to be introducing Jodi herself in a minute to say a few words about the book, after which we'll be hearing from members of our panel one at a time. And I'll introduce them when it's their turn to speak. At the end of the panel discussion, we will have time for questions that you ask, questions directed either to Jodi or to one of the panelists. So this is an important thing to note. We will not be taking questions on chat. Chat will be turned off during the presentations themselves while the faculty members speak, so that everybody can be concentrating on what they say. But we'll turn the chat on again at the Q&A session. But if you want to ask a question, you need to go to the Q&A function itself. Ask the questions on Q&A. I will collect the questions and moderate them at the end. I'll be asking the questions directed to whomever they are asked of. I will most likely pick questions that are on topic and that are short and sweet. I'm afraid we won't be able to deal with very, very long questions, and we will not be able to respond to sermons. Please keep the questions on topic, and when the chat is on, please keep it polite. We should respect one another, even if we have different views, and we are not looking for people to be staking out their positions on things in an antagonistic way. Okay, so with all of that, I'm going to introduce our session. Jodi Magness is an internationally known archaeologist of ancient Israel. She's a member of the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Since 2002, she's been the Kenan Distinguished Professor for Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism in our Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. She's authored numerous books, 3 of which have won major prizes, and the last of which we are going to be talking about today, Jerusalem Through the Ages. So, Jodi, welcome.
Thank you, Bart. And let me get started here because I want to be as brief as possible to allow time for our panelists to be able to speak. And I just want to start by thanking everyone who's out there in virtual land for attending the webinar today and helping to support the department and particularly our graduate students. I am honored that my colleagues and our past and present graduate students agreed to participate, which highlights the great strengths of our department. I should mention that Jocelyn was my PhD advisee, also was an undergraduate student with us, and John Miller has served as my TA. So I'm really happy that they're both with us today, and I look forward to everyone's comments. Although writing a book about Jerusalem from its beginnings to the Crusades may seem to be an act of hubris, it has been an extremely humbling experience because Jerusalem's story is infinite. The more one knows about this city, the more one realizes the limitations of that knowledge. Jerusalem is a moving target as new discoveries constantly add to and modify our understanding of its history and archaeology, practically guaranteeing that any book like this will be out of date almost as soon as it's published. In addition, it is virtually impossible to ensure that a book with such broad coverage will be completely free of errors or omissions. For these reasons, as I explain in the preface, it was only after years of nagging by a persistent editor at Oxford University Press, that's Stefan Franke, that I agreed to write this book, and even then with great trepidation, acutely aware that there are others out there who know a great deal more about Jerusalem than I do. Many of these are colleagues, friends, and teachers from whom I've learned much over the years and whose names appear throughout the pages of the book. A few pieces of background about the book. For one thing, it turned out to be weedier than I originally envisioned, as I found it impossible to tell Jerusalem's complex story without getting into details. Thus, it is more of a semi-trade than a trade book. Nevertheless, I have endeavored to explain the history and archaeology as clearly as possible to make the book accessible to a broad readership. Following an introduction and a survey of Jerusalem's explorers are chapters presenting the history and archaeology in sequence from the Bronze Age to the Crusades. Focusing each chapter on a specific year in Jerusalem's history is intended to reduce the potential confusion caused by covering numerous periods spanning millennia, particularly for non-specialist readers. Only deceased explorers are included in the survey in Chapter 1 because it was unfeasible to include all the living archaeologists working in Jerusalem, with whom readers will become familiar throughout the other chapters. The book ends with the Crusades, as that is the limit of my expertise, and in fact, going beyond the early Islamic period was a stretch for me. A brief epilogue describes General Allenby's entry to Jerusalem, followed by an appendix with suggested walking tours. I am happy with the way the book turned out, although I realize it is not perfect and not everyone will agree with every part of my presentation and interpretations. Nowhere is the adage that no man or woman is an island truer than in academia. This book could not have been written without the support of various institutions and individuals, including a Kingdon Fellowship at the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a Fulbright Senior Research Fellowship at Tel Aviv University, and a Seymour Gittin Distinguished Professorship at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. I am also grateful for the support provided by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, especially the chair and staff of the Department of Religious Studies. Last but not least, my husband, Jim Haberman, gets the credit for preparing the illustrations for publication. Unlike the other great cities of the Mediterranean world, such as Athens, Rome, and Istanbul, Jerusalem does not occupy a strategic location on a major land thoroughfare or waterway. Instead, it has always been a relatively poor and remote mountain town. The first people to settle permanently on this spot some 5,000 years ago were attracted by a perennial source of fresh water, the Gihon Spring. But what comes to make Jerusalem special is the belief among followers of the three Abrahamic faiths that it is the place where the presence of the God of Israel dwells and the last judgment will take place. As such, Jerusalem is the meeting point of heaven and earth, the locus of divine and human interaction. My hope is that this book will convey to a wide audience the qualities that make Jerusalem special by telling its fascinating and complex story. I'm not going to speak about specific aspects of Jerusalem's history and archaeology, some of which will be raised by the panelists. Hopefully, their comments will stimulate your curiosity to learn more by reading the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jodi. So our first panelist, we've decided to go in chronological sequence, by the way. And so we're going to deal with people do the more ancient stuff before we get and move chronologically upward. And so our first panelist to make comments will be Joseph Lamb. Joseph is an associate professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern languages and literature here at UNC. Joseph.
Thank you, Bart. And it's a real great pleasure to be on this panel, be on this webinar, and to be spending this time with you all. Jodi Magness's new book, Jerusalem Through the Ages, is a tremendously rich yet accessible look at the archaeology of arguably the most historically captivating city in the world. As a scholar of the Bible, I regularly encounter research related to ancient Jerusalem, whether from literary, historical, or archaeological perspectives. I've also been to Jerusalem a number of times as a visitor and as a resident scholar, and so I've toured nearly all the sites mentioned in the book, often hearing the typical tour guide descriptions in the process. But I don't think I've ever read a book quite like this one, which offers a grand overview of the ancient and medieval history of the city, spanning some 3,000 years if we're counting from the Middle Bronze Age 2 onward, while also being grounded in the latest archaeological research. This last point is important because the archaeology of Jerusalem is not only inordinately complex, but it's also overladen with competing religious and ideological interests that often cloud the way that its results are presented. And so it's truly a breath of fresh air to read a clear, scientifically oriented presentation provided by one of the very few experts in the world capable of synthesizing this massive information and evaluating it in a balanced way. So allow me here to just give some highlights, things that stood out to me from the early chapters of the book, which are the ones closest to my area of expertise. Following the introduction and before the historical overview, there is a chapter on the explorers, which covers the major 19th and 20th century pioneers who laid the foundations of the archaeological study of Jerusalem as we know it today. For me, I learned so much not only about the work of early explorers that I had heard of before, such as Edward Robinson, Charles Warren, Charles Clement Ganneau, but also about some less familiar figures with interesting roles to play. So Louis Félicien de Saulcy is an interesting character, if you read the book, whose archaeological judgment was suspect, but who nonetheless made some important contributions. Conrad Schick, I learned, was apparently, quote, the first to report on the ancient Hebrew inscription in the Siloam Tunnel. And Raymond Weil was, quote, the first Jewish archaeologist to conduct excavations in Jerusalem. Now, the next few chapters on Jebusite Jerusalem, Israelite Jerusalem, and Judahite Jerusalem are the ones that pertain most directly to my work. And I'll admit, I came to them curious to learn exactly what Jodi's positions were on a number of live and lively debates in the field. These chapters did not disappoint, as she adeptly summarized all the major debates, while also making her positions clear when she had a strong position. So for instance, her 11 pages on Jerusalem's water system, this is pages 45 through 56, are the clearest distillation of the recent scholarly discussion that I have ever read. And it's quite a complicated discussion and with a lot of changing views. She observes that the one element of the water system that archaeologists agree likely dates to the Middle Bronze Age is the Siloam Channel, not to be confused with the Siloam Tunnel, while the evidence for the other elements is less certain. As for the features known as the stepped stone structure and large stone structure, which are both located on the southeastern hill, or the so-called City of David, Jodi dates them to the late Bronze Age Iron Age transition, or basically the 12th century BCE. She also offers some illuminating comments on the maximalist-minimalist debate in relation to the kingdoms of David and Solomon. So she writes, quote, Jerusalem has always been a relatively impoverished and isolated mountain town, lacking in natural resources and removed from the major thoroughfares, bisecting the country, page 87. But at the same time, she notes that this does not preclude its possibility of serving as a capital of a minor kingdom, as sort of shown by the analogy with relatively small towns serving as state capitals here in the US in the modern day. This leads to my final observation, which has a bit of a question, or at least a request for comment embedded in it. In reading the book, I was struck again by how meager the archaeological remains are for Jerusalem in the late Bronze Age. So estimates are of a city less than 11 acres and a population of maybe 1,000 inhabitants. But as a textual scholar, I tend to associate late Bronze Age Jerusalem with the evidence from the Amarna letters, hailing from the same time period. And these are these include 6 letters, cuneiform letters written from a certain vassal named Abdi-Heba from Jerusalem to the Egyptian pharaoh. And so these imply that Jerusalem was at least a hub of Egyptian control of the region during this time. Now, the book does address this textual evidence, but my question would be how Jodi might suggest for textual scholars like me to maybe recalibrate our understanding of evidence like this, particular terms we read in ancient texts like city, city-state, land, and so forth. Anyhow, I'll yield my time here. I enjoyed the book thoroughly and look forward to our subsequent discussion.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. So I think since you've asked Jodi a question, we better hear her answer. Jodi.
Well, thank you, Joseph, for your remarks. And so, I mean, I can't tell you how to translate those terms from the Near Eastern text, right? But I do think that part of the problem is that even if they're being translated correctly, that doesn't mean that what is called a city in ancient texts correlates with what we would think of as a city today, right? So I think that the value here of archaeology is in showing that these texts need to be understood somewhat, differently in some cases than the way that they're usually understood. And that, I think that's true, overall throughout the whole book. That comes through. It comes through with, the whole debates about all the other biblical debates related to Jerusalem, right? So how do you relate the way Jerusalem is described in the biblical text to what we actually have on the ground. And readers of the book will also see repeatedly, especially for these earliest periods, that the remains are indeed very meager, and that is for various reasons. They're founded on bedrock. The bedrock was often, the later building often cleared to bedrock, when they constructed and or reused walls and rebuilt them over the course of time. So the earliest periods are very poorly represented in the archaeological record. And this doesn't mean that there wasn't anything going on there. It just means that it's really hard to isolate in the archaeological record. But I do think that it's true that Jerusalem in the Bronze Age and even in the early part of the Iron Age we would consider it to be a very small and modest settlement and not fitting our concept of what a city is. And I will just say that part on the water systems killed me. I mean, it was so hard to write because it's so complicated. And I just kept going, oh my gosh, how am I going to explain this? So I'm glad you found it helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jodi. So let me remind everybody who's attending that if you have questions, please feel free to enter them on the Q&A function. Just click on the Q&A. And, if you have questions that you think, well, this is too dumb to ask. No, it's not too dumb to ask. My view as a teacher is that there are never dumb questions. They're just dumb answers. That's the one that we give. So please, if you've got questions, go ahead and ask them. We're going to move now to our next panelist, Jocelyn Burney. Jocelyn is the Assistant Professor of Classics, Archaeology, and Religion at the University of Missouri. She graduated from our department at UNC in 2023, specializing in archaeology and working with Jodi. So Jocelyn, say some nice things about your teacher.
Thanks, Bart. Yeah, thanks and to all the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel to celebrate Jodi's new book. It's a bit of a full circle moment for me to get to discuss this because in spring 2022, 2 years ago, as Jodi was finishing up the manuscript of this book, she and I were both fellows at the Albright Institute in Jerusalem. And at that time, I was in the midst of writing my dissertation, and it was really inspiring to see my PhD advisor sitting there forging ahead on her own writing project at the same time. I have many memories from that semester of seeing Jodi walk out of the Albright in the morning with her backpack on, ready to spend the day walking around the city to take the photos for this book. And fortuitously, since it was spring 2022, we were just coming out of COVID and the city was completely devoid of tourists. So one of the great assets, I think, of this book is that the photographs are excellent. Jodi took most of them, and there are hardly any people in any of the photos. So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's something really special about this book. So the organizers asked me to discuss 3 chapters from Jerusalem Through the Ages that cover the Hasmonean period through Hadrian's reconstruction of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina in the 2nd century CE. Jodi successfully shows us that there's never been a dull period in the life of the city, but I contend that this roughly 400-year period was particularly eventful, including the Maccabean revolt, the murder and mayhem of the Hasmoneans and the Herodians, the growing tension and even violence among the Jewish sects in Jerusalem, 2 bloody revolts, and of course, the dramatic destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE. In her characteristically clear and engaging style, Jodi leads us through these dramatic events, which she brings to life with archaeological evidence. And I'll echo Joseph in saying that one of the most exciting things about this book is the amount of new archaeological data that is included. For the 3 chapters that I'm reporting on, this includes the results of excavations in the Western Wall Plaza, where new sections of the Cardo from Aelia Capitolina have been discovered, as well as the Givati parking lot excavations, where the excavators have exposed the remains of what they believe are the Acra fortress and the palace of Queen Helena of Adiabene. In the interest of time, I'd like to mention 3 topics from these chapters that I think folks will find especially interesting. First, this is a book about Jerusalem, and unsurprisingly, an important theme that emerges in these 3 chapters is the difference between Jerusalem as a real place and Jerusalem as an imagined place, both in the past and in the future. Many of the apocalyptic and messianic writers of the Second Temple period, like the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, rejected the Jerusalem of their day in favor of a future idealized Jerusalem. Others look to the past, when Jerusalem served as the capital of an independent Israelite kingdom. Herod the Great, who's a major character over these 3 chapters, encompasses both of these visions of Jerusalem, I think. Jodi aptly notes that by restoring the Jerusalem temple, Herod may have sought to connect himself with Solomon. And yet, by expanding the Temple Mount to its greatest extent, greater, I believe, than it was in the time of Solomon, he was also fashioning himself as a messianic figure in order to legitimize his rule. Jodi has written about this aspect of Herod's identity in relation to his tomb at Herodium near Bethlehem. But if there's time after this, Jodi, I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about how you think Herod is deliberately using these two traditions about Jerusalem, the idealized city of the past and then the future apocalyptic city, specifically in his rebuilding of the temple. Was this a rebuilding, like a remaking of a past temple, or what we might call a pre-building toward a future Jerusalem? Second, in her chapter on Herodian Jerusalem, this theme of the imagined city comes up again in relation to tombs and burials in a really interesting way. After surveying some of the major tombs from the Herodian period, like the tomb of Queen Helena of Adiabene and the Akeldama tombs, Jodi makes a really important observation that many of Jerusalem's largest and finest tombs from this period were not built by local residents of Jerusalem, but in fact by diaspora Jews who chose to have their remains taken to the city to be buried there. One of the big questions in the study of ancient diaspora Judaism is to what degree diaspora Jews felt connected to Jerusalem and to the temple, especially if they never visited the Holy Land. When scholars discuss this topic, they typically rely on textual sources like the writings of Philo and Josephus, who give us some clues about pilgrimage to the Holy Land and tithing to the temple, but not really a concrete picture of what actually happened. So I think Jodi's point about these tombs deserves more attention because they give us evidence not only of diaspora Jews visiting Jerusalem, but paying huge sums of money to have their remains brought there, and also influencing the burial practices of locals, most likely. And finally, for me, the highlight of these three chapters is Jodi's discussion of Jerusalem's third wall, which served as the city's outermost line of defense in the mid-first century CE until around 300 CE. Jodi uses archaeological and epigraphic evidence to make a persuasive argument that the third wall lay about 450 meters north of what is now the north wall of the old city, putting her into debate with scholars who believe that the city was much smaller during that period. I fondly remember hearing Jodi's arguments for the so-called maximalist view of the third wall as an undergraduate at UNC, and it's fun to see that discoveries made since then affirm her position, like the remains of a fortification wall and tower, probably from the third wall, that were uncovered in the Russian compound in 2016. I'll end with a quick anecdote related to the third wall, which is that during our stay at the Albright in 2022, Jodi gave a public lecture about the location of the third wall based on the research that she was doing for this book. By a remarkable coincidence, the Albright Institute actually sits along the line of the third wall. And one of the towers of the third wall actually extends into the Albright's property and has been surveyed there. After giving her lecture, Jodi surprised the crowd of academics and archaeologists by telling everyone that we were going to go on a walk. Suffice it to say, there were some very confused looks. This is not how an academic lecture usually goes. But she won us over and led us out of the gates in the Albright and down the street, pointing out all of the remains of the third wall as we went. I think there's no one better to teach us about the archaeology of Jerusalem than Jodi Magness, and I offer her many congratulations for this excellent book.
Okay, thanks, Jocelyn. Jodi, you had a couple questions in there.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Yeah, good times, remembering good times at the Albright.
Yeah.
So, okay, about Herod, thank you. That whole thing about Herod is something that I would love to expand upon in the future. That article that I published, which was in the Journal of Ancient Judaism, I think was back in like 2019 or something. It was getting to the point where it was going to turn into a book. And I thought, if I don't stop it here, I won't finish it. But I would like to continue along the lines that you suggested. I'll just say that. I'm not going to, I won't go into more, but I'll just say, yes, that's definitely a line that I have in my head of continuing that line about Herod. About the diaspora Jews and the burials, by the way, very interesting. If you think about, you have the same sort of phenomenon at Beit Sharim, right? Where a little later, where we also have quite a number of prominent diaspora Jewish burials. And then going back to the Second Temple period, interestingly, as you were talking, I was thinking of Nicanor of Alexandria, who donated that gate to the temple, but we also have his tomb, his family tomb, on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's hard to say that all of those diaspora Jews were brought for burial versus having settled in the city, but I think it's a mixture of the two. So a very interesting phenomenon. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, great, thanks. So our next panelist is Hugo Mendez, who is an associate professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at UNC. Hugo.
Thank you. It's a privilege to have been invited onto this panel celebrating Jodi Magness's rich new book, Jerusalem Through the Ages. You know, I always tell my graduate students that the one downside of becoming a faculty member is that you'll never get to take the classes of your colleagues. But reading their work gives you the next best thing. And Jodi's book is nothing short of a masterclass. It's an impressive survey of thousands of years of history, politics, religion, and culture. There are few scholars who can produce a work of this scope, and there are still fewer who can do so with the sophistication of Jodi Magness. I'm a scholar of ancient and late ancient Christianity in Jerusalem, intersecting that. I have nothing but praise for this book. Congratulations, Jodi. In introduction, Jodi asks the question, why has Jerusalem, this poor and isolated mountain town, exerted such a powerful hold on billions of people worldwide over the course of millennia? The simple answer, she continues, is that Jerusalem has been the meeting point of heaven and earth for so many people, the locus of divine and human interaction. But what struck me most when reading this book was the incredible fact that Jerusalem has retained this imagined status even as everything celestial and terrestrial has changed around the city. The gods have changed through the millennia, as have the cults and devotions used to approach them. So too have the polities, ethnicities, cultures, and languages that have claimed Jerusalem. And of course, the city itself, by any measure, has undergone numerous transformations, topographically, architecturally, through so many periods of growth, expansion, and contraction. Jodi tracks these parallel changes across her work. In her introduction, for instance, she notes that the city still incorporates the name of one of these long-lost gods, Shalem, the Jebusite god of twilight or the setting sun, who, she says, perhaps was worshipped on the rocky outcrop in the center of the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock now stands. But in later chapters, Jodi details how the same mount became recognized as the dwelling place or footstool of the Israelite and Jewish God under his many shifting names and epithets, a God worshipped in 2 successive temples described in the Hebrew Bible. In another chapter, she details how the Romans reoriented the religious life in the city around new pagan temples to the west of the Mount during one of the periods that I study. Still later in the text, she highlights how Christians and Muslims would begin to recognize even more sites and objects in the city as conduits of the divine. One of the objects she mentions in this context has been a subject of my research interests, namely the bones of Stephen, which were purportedly rediscovered or invented in the year 415 CE. In my first book, The Cult of Stephen in Jerusalem, published in 2022, I dedicated a chapter to this discovery. Specifically, I explored the ways in which 5th century Christians use the bones of Stephen to construct the city of Jerusalem as, in my words, quote, a permanent nexus between heavenly life and earthly flock, conducting miraculous power to the world. But Jodi surveys other such sites and objects in the Byzantine period, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Nea Church of Mary, the Eleona, and others. What reading Jodi's book really stirred in my mind was a profound awareness of how many sites in Jerusalem, how many different sites in Jerusalem have sequentially condensed its unique religious significance. The city may represent a single idea in many imaginaries, but the center and focal point of that idea, the actual point of contact with the divine, has moved, danced multiple times across the city's landscape as that landscape has been transformed, not least in the post-70 CE period. Some of these sites are still significant. Many others have faded into history. I think an awareness of that constant dynamism is something that will inform our discussion that follows. I will say, I know that it will inform my scholarship in years to come, and it's an insight that Jodi's book illuminated in new ways for me as a reader. So thank you, Jodi. Congratulations again on this work, and looking forward to the discussion that follows.
Okay, thank you, Hugo. So our next presenter is John Miller. John is a graduate student in the Department of Religious Studies who works on Islamic studies. So John, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all those in attendance. I'm grateful to participate in this panel. To use my time as judiciously as possible, I will speak about Jodi Magness's new book, Jerusalem Through the Ages, both in how it intersects with my own field of Islamic studies, as well as how it interplays with certain prevailing assumptions and ideas in our broader public discourse. Let me begin with the latter question first. Given that the book is an approachable, linear, meticulously researched historical study, why give any consideration to us, the public, as an implied audience? Why not simply let the text speak for itself, as it were? Jodi's book is, after all, systematic and comprehensive in its scope. It addresses the millennia when Jerusalem was inhabited by the Canaanites, and known then as Rushalimon, and as Yebus, the city of the Jebusites, and it covers the military conquest by David, to much later conquest by the Romans and rule by the Byzantines, the first Muslim caliphs, and then the Crusaders. But it is precisely because of this scope that, were I teaching with this book, I would prioritize the point of pedagogy that history does not imply necessity. Students and readers may, in general, be accustomed to conceiving of Jerusalem as a perennially contested space. Perhaps this has been so since the dawn of time. And readers will find in this study a narrative that would seem to lend support to that view. This land of the Canaanites has indeed been conquered and inhabited and conquered and inhabited again and again. But what ought a reader conclude from such a narrative? Has modern-day Egypt, for instance, truly had any fewer changes in rulership than Palestine, or has Iraq? And yet we do not tend to view these lands as somehow outside the regular forces of human history, as eternally disputed according to some inescapable historical imperative. One may also wonder whether the presence of specialists on Christianity, Judaism, and Islam on this panel supports the view that past conflicts or the grave humanitarian crisis in the present are in some way essentially religious in cause or nature, that there must be a clash of civilizations among dogmatic and uncompromising traditions. And I do not read Jodi's book to support that conclusion, and I will now attend to that question via her chapter on Jerusalem under the early Muslim Caliphate. What is present in these pages underscores what can be seen throughout the previous chapters, that Jerusalem is a symbol embodying diverse meanings to diverse actors. Muslims have never been homogeneous, nor could they be, and thus Jerusalem has been valued in multifaceted, divergent, and overlapping ways. And I will highlight only two here: Jerusalem as the prize of the conqueror, and Jerusalem as the trust of the caretaker. We may look first at the Umayyad dynasty, the first hereditary empire of Muslim rulers, who viewed Jerusalem as a prize and a token of supremacy. The Umayyad rulers represented the Syrian elite. Their founder had, with a mix of strength and cunning, wrestled political power away from Muhammad's son-in-law, and his successors desired nothing more than to flaunt their wealth and grandeur as proof of divine favor. As Jodi describes, the Dome of the Rock, commenced by the Caliph Abdul Malik, depicts lavish mosaics of jeweled crowns, pendants, and necklaces, each of these representing the royal adornments of the defeated Byzantine and Persian rulers, and therefore the triumph of Islam. Echoing important scholarship by Patricia Crona and Martin Hinds, Jodi points out that many of the Umayyads in fact called themselves Khalifatullah. They were not the dutiful inheritors of Muhammad's legacy. Rather, they viewed themselves as nothing short of God's authoritative representatives on earth. And there's evidence that the Umayyads, who had established their capital in Damascus, hoped that this structure might even replace the Kaaba in Mecca as the focal point of Islamic piety. But Jodi shows us that this triumphalism is only one layer of the story. Muhammad had, early in his career, instructed his followers to pray in reverence facing Jerusalem, not Mecca, reflecting the view that the same God of Moses, David, and Solomon had, at last, chosen to speak to a Gentile prophet through the line of Ishmael. And whereas earlier European historical writing tended to describe the Muslim armies as frothing religious zealots, Jodi draws on more recent scholarship and archaeology. She notes the transition from Byzantine to Islamic rule was generally peaceful and was not accompanied by widespread destruction, nor was it followed by an immediate decline in population or prosperity. What the early Muslims in Jerusalem did discover was that the Byzantines had been using the Temple Mount as a garbage mound in a supersessionist initiative to elevate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Under, quote, Muslim rule, Jodi describes Jerusalem as home to the Melkite Patriarch, to Jacobites, Copts, Armenians, Georgians, and Latin Christians, and Rabbinic and Karaite Jews who had been expelled under the Byzantines once again lived in the city. I'm not, of course, contending that this period in Jerusalem was a pluralistic paradise or a convivencia. That too would not tell the whole story. The Caliph Omar, who first ruled in the city, for example, is often criticized for his ardor and intensity, even in the earliest Muslim sources. And to be sure, early Islamic empire building should be viewed as no less problematic to the modern eye than any other empire building in antiquity. But the same triumphalist Umayyads who built the Dome of the Rock also repaired the Temenos Wall of the Temple Mount, Wilson's Arch, and Solomon's Stables. And perhaps most significantly, they also produced coins depicting 5 and 7-branched candlesticks to honor the temple menorah. As the scholar Wendy Doniger reminds us, symbols and myths are not active motive forces. They are malleable, flexible tools that human beings employ for their individual purposes. They expand, shift, and contract across time, as Abdul Karim Soroush argues. And Jerusalem's meaning is no exception. A site of conquest for early Israelites and Muslims alike, but also a space for reverent caretakers, those who patiently sweep away litter, and for those who hold space for others whose identities and the significance they find in the city may differ markedly from their own. Thank you so much, Dr. Magness.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. Very good. Thank you. Our last panelist is Yaakov Ariel. Yaakov is a professor of religions in America and of Jewish studies at UNC. Yaakov. You're muted, Yaakov. You just remuted yourself, Yaakov.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you for being the moderator. Thank you for the organizers. And thank you, Jodi, for just a wonderful book. Since we're talking about Jerusalem, I should mention that I have met Jodi in Jerusalem 50 years ago, a little bit more, as we were both students at the Hebrew University in its previous campus. And we met actually in a class in which the professor who taught medieval history became later on very much interested in the history and archaeology of Jerusalem. I can go on and on with anecdotes, but I would say that already there I was very impressed by Jodi, and who I thought was outstanding in spite of being modest and not making any claims to herself. She even denied any connection to the founder of the Hebrew University, whose name was Magness. I'd like to congratulate you on your book, and many people have done that already. I highly recommend this book. I'm highly appreciative of it. I really enjoyed reading it. And I should say that everybody here mentioned how comprehensive, how you weaved things together, your knowledge. I should say that I also very much liked the style, which I thought was very matter of fact, fascinating, dynamic, but not argumentative and not political, but rather neutral. At least that's the way I read it. Writing about Jerusalem is almost never neutral. And this is the most neutral book I've read about the history and archaeology of that city. I'm also happy, and I'll move here, I'll become a little bit provocative. I won't be as nice as everyone. And that is that I very much was happy that you have not only included Christianity, everybody does that, it's usually Judaism or Islam and Christianity, but that you have also pointed out to the importance, sometimes indirectly, or I would be provocative, unwittingly, of the Christian presence and the importance of the city to Christianity or other Christianities. In your chapter on the Byzantine period, you emphasize the fact that the discovery, if you will, it shouldn't be discovery, rediscovery, the appearance of Helena and Constantine, the building projects, which went on and on, you described the Nea, added not only an important layer to the city reached its utmost prosperity until the late 20th century in the Byzantine period. And it's something that would disappear, but won't really disappear, in the sense that Byzantine infrastructure stayed. Many of the important churches and sites stayed, even if they were rebuilt, including extensively during the Crusader period. There is, with some exception, there is a continuity of Christian presence and Christian fascination with Jerusalem. And here I'll take it from your work, which ended with the Crusades, to my work, which starts in the modern era. And I wrote about Protestant Jerusalem, and I'd like to take your work there, amazingly, but not only Protestant. There is a claim that Palestine in general was rediscovered in the 19th century following the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt and then his excursion to Palestine. This changed the Middle East forever. And then the Egyptian invasion of Palestine in the 1830s, which opened Palestine to Western powers and Western pilgrimages, tourism, activities, and stayed that way willy-nilly during the Ottoman period. It's not just Protestant, it's Christian groups in general, I need to correct myself, and Christian empires and powers. The 19th century became, and early 20th century became, a ground of competition between Christian groups and Christian powers, and Jerusalem became the major beneficiary of an incredible investment of money, manpower, political efforts, building projects, including hospitals, schools, institutions of research. The first, if we speak about modern archaeology, then this is the 19th century Christian fascination with Jerusalem that brought some of the archaeologists, Jocelyn and Jocelyn and others have mentioned, and Joseph in the narrative. In 1917, which you mentioned, when Allenby entered Jerusalem, the city, first of all, the Christian population was much, much larger in relative terms than it is today. It was an important segment demographically, politically, economically, but also the infrastructure of the city, as poor and as limited as it was, Jerusalem was beginning to take, if you will, a Western outlook and have infrastructure, including the road from Jerusalem to Jaffa, which became safer and brought more tourists than before. I don't think that Arabs and Jews would have had the same presence in Jerusalem and perhaps in Palestine in general without the importance of Jerusalem for Christianity and the investment and interest of Christian powers. In some ways, that too, as a number of historians tell us, brought the British to Palestine. I should give another example, and that is 1947, November 1947. The UN decision on partition of Palestine, which needed to receive 2/3 of the vote at the UN at that time, mostly through the vote of Catholic countries, many of them Latin American. They voted on the assumption that Jerusalem is going to be part of an international zone. Something forgotten almost completely today, the corpus separatum, that Jerusalem was intended to be basically run by Christian nations. Without that, you wouldn't have had the state of Israel and Palestine as part of Jordan and Egypt for a while as they developed. Later on, many of those states regretted that. So that's in part of history that isn't there. I'm emphasizing it because I think that Christianity is not just the third layer in the triangle or the minor one. I think that it is at the center of the story of Jerusalem, starting with Constantine, of course, earlier, but with the magnitude, the pilgrimages, the sites, we have, and all the way to the fact that even in the last 50 years, the majority of tourists who come to Jerusalem are Christians, currently mostly evangelical, but that's a whole different story. And for that, you'll need to write a new book, one of your many, many, many books. Thank you, Jodi, for being so dynamic, so enriching, and for including everything that is important, I think, to all of us in that book.
Okay, thank you, Yaakov. So we have a number of questions from people. Jodi, my idea is to move right into the questions. Is that okay, or do you want to respond to any of these?
I don't know. I'm happy to do that. I don't know if you want any of the panelists, if they have any other comments that they might have thought of during the course of the discussion so far, if they want to say anything before we turn to the Q&A. No? Okay. So sure, that's fine.
Okay, let's go to Q&A. Okay, so I have a number of interesting questions. The first one is, do we have archaeological evidence for the pre-Davidic past of Jerusalem? This question points out that in the book of Judges, there's a mention of Jerusalem before Israel entered into the land. And so they're wondering, do you deal with the pre-Davidic stuff? And
Yes.
So what do you say?
Yeah, sure. Yes, that's actually easy to answer. Yes, that's the chapter that Joseph focused on, the chapter on what we call the Bronze Age in archaeology, which I call Jebusite Jerusalem, which refers to pre-Davidic Jerusalem, right? The inhabitants of Jerusalem, according to the biblical account, were Jebusites, and that is the period that is covered in that sort of first chapter after I have the introduction and the explorers. So yes, remember, of course, that the city at that point is not Israelite. It's a pre-Israelite population. But yes, that is covered in the book, and you can read all about it for sure.
Okay. So my personal follow-up on that is so when is the earliest archaeological evidence for Jerusalem?
The earliest, okay, I'm not muted. The earliest archaeological evidence for permanent settlement in Jerusalem, as opposed to somebody just, maybe casually stopping by and camping overnight or something. But the earliest the earliest evidence of permanent settlement is at the beginning of the early Bronze Age. So that's about 5,000 years ago. And that it comes from a small number of tombs that we have which contain pottery that's typical of the early Bronze Age, and some, again, scrappy but remains of houses from that period. So we can say that permanent settlement in Jerusalem goes back at least 5,000 years.
So someone else had asked about the Bronze Age stuff, and they want to know what that is.
What the Bronze Age is?
Yeah. So I think Joseph first mentioned Bronze Age. I'm not sure. So yeah. So can
right.
You just say what those are?
That. Yeah. I actually do explain this also in the book. So at the very beginning, actually in the introduction, the last section of the introduction is about chronology, how we describe time. And I explain there what, how archaeologists use the term Bronze Age and Iron Age. So again, I encourage you to read the book. But these are terms that basically go back to the time of the Industrial Revolution, when archaeologists and scholars devised a means of categorizing ancient artifacts, and the framework that was chosen was technology, right? That how advanced a civilization is can be measured by the type of tools that they use, the materials that they use to make their tools. So you get this division into Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And anyway, but there's a section in the book that explains that further. So Bronze Age is basically the period when, if we follow the biblical account, when the country was inhabited by the Canaanites. And it was in this period that Jerusalem was inhabited by the Jebusites, who may or may not be related to the Canaanites. We don't know. We don't know the answer to that one.
Okay, so could you just give us a rough idea of the time periods?
Oh, sorry. Okay. So again, starting about 5,000 years ago, actually a little bit earlier, but I won't give exact dates. So let's say very roughly around 3000 BC, a little bit earlier, and then going up to 1200 BC or BCE. That 1200 BCE marks the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Mhm.
All right. Next question. What do you think about the benefits or not of muongraphy for archaeologists? I think muongraphy, that refers to cosmic rays or something.
I don't know about that, and I've never heard of it employed in
Okay.
archaeology. So I can't actually answer that question. Sorry about that.
I wish I had come up with that question, Jodi. I've never had a
Yeah,
question you couldn't answer.
I don't know what
I need a, okay. All right.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think you'll know the answer to this next question. Jodi, what is your opinion on the Talpiot tomb?
I actually have, I'm not gonna go off on the Talpiot tomb, but
no, but people won't know what it is. So first of all, explain what it is.
So first of all, let me just say though, that I do have a section in the book, in the chapter on Herodian Jerusalem, about the Talpiot tomb. And I've also written about it elsewhere. So, I mean, you can read all about what I have to say about the Talpiot tomb. I will say that the Talpiot tomb is a tomb, and a tomb of the late Second Temple period, so 1st century CE, 1st century AD, that was discovered and was excavated by archaeologists back in like the 1980, I guess it was, in a modern neighborhood in Jerusalem called Talpiot, which is located sort of to the southwest of the old city. It is a tomb that is very typical of rock-cut tombs of this period. It's got these niches for burials that are called loculi. It contained little stone containers, boxes that are called ossuaries, to contain bones that were removed after the flesh had decayed from the loculi, and then they were collected into these little stone boxes. And what distinguishes this tomb is that the ossuaries were, some of the ossuaries in it were inscribed with names, and that, by the way, is also very common, that ossuaries were inscribed with the names of the deceased whose remains were placed in them. But this particular tomb yielded a series of ossuaries inscribed with names that sound very biblical. So you get a sort of a Jesus, and you get a Joseph, and you get a Mary. Anyway, so kind of like that. And the archaeologists who excavated the tomb and then published it, it was published in 1996 in a scientific journal, noted the correspondence, but also noted that all of these names are very common among the Jewish population in this period, so we really can't say anything about it. But then in like the early 2000s, a filmmaker apparently came across the publication and decided that this must be the tomb of Jesus, and his family produced produced a program that was broadcast on the Discovery Channel, making that claim, which was very sensational, because if it in fact is true, then it would mean that that Jesus was married, because there's an individual in the tomb and who's named as the son of Jesus. So Jesus was married and had a family, but more spectacularly, that he was not resurrected from the dead, because his physical remains would have been gathered and put into an ossuary. So very, very sensational claims. Got a lot of publicity, but is absolutely not true, in my opinion. And I lay out the reasons why I say that. So that's the encapsulation of it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So one of the questions, I think maybe Joseph had said early on about going to tour guides and hearing all sorts of things about Jerusalem. And so one person wanted to know what the what kinds of mistakes, like everybody goes to Jerusalem, here's these, here's a tour guide saying this happened here, this happened there. Are there like a couple things that you just drive you nuts about what tour guides say, or do you think they're pretty accurate usually?
Oh, wow, what a loaded question, Bart.
I'll tell you my favorite one. The first time I was in Jerusalem, with the tour guide took us up to an upper room and say, this is, we're talking about Jesus' Last Supper in the upper room. And somebody said, well, is this like the upper room? He said, no, this is just a second floor room.
Right. So, I mean, it's like everywhere else. It depends on who the tour guide is. Overall, I think that Israeli tour guides tend to be very good.
Yeah.
Because they go through a very rigorous period of training. They have to, kind of keep up. They have, courses that are offered periodically that they have to participate in to keep up on, more recent discoveries and scholarship. So overall, I find them to be pretty good. I think where you might get into trouble sometimes is when you're with somebody who's not a tour guide who's licensed through the state of Israel, but rather somebody who may be, let's say, a clergy person with their congregation, who's presenting things in a certain way. So, but overall, I find, Israeli tour guides to be pretty good. Yeah, but I do see a question, and I don't know if you want me to.
I'm getting into it.
Okay.
I've got them all.
Okay.
The next question is, how helpful do you find Constantine's wife, I think it means mother, Helena, and her marking of holy places in Jerusalem, or are they more mythic than historical?
Well, I'll say something, but I would love to hear Hugo talk about this. But I'll just say with regard to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is
you need to give the background because I don't think people know.
Oh, okay. So the background is that Constantine in the early 4th century comes and that his mother Helena comes to Jerusalem and finds the remains of the true cross, and Constantine then builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on that spot to mark to enshrine the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. And the question is whether that is the authentic spot or not. And I do discuss that in the book. What I eventually say is, look, so the problem here is that there's a 300-year gap in time between the death of Jesus, the time Jesus dies, and the time Constantine builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it's really impossible to verify that during that period of 300 years, the local population preserved an accurate memory that this was in fact the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried, right? So to accept the authenticity of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you have to assume that that is the case. There are remains of ancient Jewish tombs in the area of the church, and this is not to say that Jesus's body was necessarily laid into one of these tombs, but there are ancient Jewish rock-cut tombs in the area of the church, which indicate that area was a cemetery in the time of Jesus. And that's important because it shows that spot lay outside the walls of the city in the time of Jesus. And one of the big controversies about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and its authenticity is, did it lie outside the walls in the time of Jesus? Because the gospel accounts specifically describe Jesus being led through a gate in the wall of the city and taken outside the city to be crucified. So we can say, I think, archaeology supports that this was outside the walls of the city in the time of Jesus. What archaeology cannot do is prove that Jesus was crucified on this spot and that his body was laid to rest. On the other hand, it is one of the very earliest Christian traditions that we have, because before the time of Constantine, Christianity was an illegal, outlawed religion in the Roman Empire. Christians were not allowed to worship openly. They were not allowed to build churches. So this means that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the very, very earliest churches that was ever built. Goes back, again, to about as early as you can go. And therefore, you're left with a 300-year gap, but also with a continuous tradition that goes back a very long way in time. And that, by the way, is exactly the opposite of what you have with the Talpio tomb. There's a whole bunch of problems with the Talpio tomb, but with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is an ancient tradition. I don't have a particular, one way or the other, except to say that the evidence that we have points to, the authenticity of that tradition, but cannot prove it. We cannot demonstrate that scientifically. And I would love to hear
Hugo,
Hugo on this.
Yeah, Hugo, do you have a?
Well, I am not an archaeologist, so I will tread even more lightly through all of this sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, the other intersecting issues that are often brought up, so here, the kind of significant work for me when I think of this question is Joan Taylor's, right, Jerusalem, the Holy Places, et cetera, discussion in the 1990s, which dealt with the question of how much substance can we really give to these particular early Christian traditions around the 4th and 5th century, late antique Christian traditions that assigned particular biblical events to particular sites. And one of the questions that kind of intersects this is the question of, well, what about possible pagan associations that these sites had? Was there potentially a desire to compete with, remove pagan temples, pagan cave shrines, or things like that, and assign new significance to spaces that were being frequented by, a religious tradition that represented a competition for Christianity in the 4th and 5th century. I'll say that the one that has, the only one that I ever dealt with in kind of my work was really the Mount Zion churches, the Ayia Sion church, which is on one of the western mountains in Jerusalem, or summits, hills in Jerusalem. That's kind of one of those points where a lot of people do tend to think that that particular site has some sort of deep history. You'll frequently find in scholarship, especially a certain kind of more maximalist scholarship, the claim that this particular site was actually truly the site of the first Christian community in Jerusalem and a constantly functioning essentially worship site for at least a Jewish Christianity for centuries. And I've never been convinced by that. I think when I look at the literary sources that are used to support that, I see them as much more ambiguous than certain scholars are putting together. And so, yeah, I tend to kind of approach some of these things with skepticism, recognizing, as I think Jodi does, the limits of what we can know and what we can ever predicate in history.
Okay.
Can I piggyback that? And Hugo, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I had also thought to mention this, even with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of course, because Hadrian reportedly built a temple, a pagan Roman temple, dedicated apparently to Venus, Aphrodite. Some scholars claim it was the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. But anyway, on the spot where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was later built by Constantine. And so there's kind of a question here, if you're thinking about this. So did Hadrian build his temple on that spot because it was already venerated by Christians, right, as the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried? Or did Constantine build the church on that spot because Hadrian's temple was there, right? So there you have that chicken and egg question. Yeah.
Yeah. Because, I mean, yeah, for that view, it's that it was trying to retake over a temple to Aphrodite to make it a Christian site. Yeah, right. Okay, I think we need to end now. I want to thank you, Jodi, for the book and for this presentation. It's been very enlightening, and thank you all the panelists as well for some really interesting insights into all of that. Those of you who've been participating in this, the attendees, I want to remind you that we are using this as a fundraiser for the department, and if you would go to religion.unc.edu, you'll be able to make a donation. Any amount would be very gratefully received. Those of you who came, we'll be sending out a survey for you to see about what you enjoyed about this, and because we want to do more of these in the future. We are recording this, and we will be able to distribute the recording as well, so you can catch up with all the details later. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you.